Well, thank you, Nicole, for inviting me, and Ashley for all your patience and help. And thanks to Robert Watson for referring me to you to begin with. I think today's a fitting day to be talking about Into the Arms of Strangers, because yesterday was the 83rd anniversary of Kristallnacht, November 9th, 1938, when the Nazis went on the rampage in Germany and Austria and Sudetenland, smashing and destroying and setting on fire synagogues and Jewish-owned businesses, and breaking into homes and arresting boys and men and putting them in early concentration camps before they became killing centers. That was the event that precipitated the British decision to take in the children, which was the KinderTransport. The KinderTransport was a child rescue effort that saved the lives of 10,000 children whose parents had to make the impossible decision to put them on trains and send them away to safety with strangers in an unknown country, different language, different customs, different food, different everything, for an indeterminate period of time. The British took in children from infancy up to 17 years old. 17 was the cutoff point. Older than that would not be accepted. And again, they were called unaccompanied minors. They had to come alone. And my mother was one of the children, and she never spoke about it. I think we have photographs of my mother and me. So that was me with her. She was born in Germany in 1928, and her parents, my grandparents, Avram and Alta Bazia, Avramovitsi, put her on a train when she looked like this. This was the age she was, immediately following her 11th birthday on July 24th, 1939. She brought along with her, we know that she brought along with her a pencil case. The big question is, when you could only bring a rucksack and a suitcase, what is it you pack? You weren't allowed to take any valuables, according to the Nazis. So I still have this pencil case. It was a Mont Blanc pen and pencil case, in a pen and pencil in a very typical child's school pencil case. And I still have that. And I have some shoe trees of hers, which are quite odd. She fully expected to be reunited with her parents. And I think we have a picture of them also. Unfortunately, she never saw them again. My grandparents were deported from Chemnitz, Germany, where my mother had lived with them, to Lublin, Poland. And that happened in May 1942, and they were killed upon arrival at a really horrendous extermination camp called Belzec, which is also pronounced Belzec. Only 2 people survived that camp. I think we could take this picture down now, Ashley, if you want. I never heard about the KinderTransport outside the home. I never learned about it in school. I never talked about it, and neither did my brother or sister with any of my friends or boyfriends or anybody in our life. My mother told me 3 things. She said she lived in a castle with a lord and lady, although that did not sound to me like something as enchanting as you would think. She told me she cried herself to sleep every night for 2 years, which was a pretty dramatic thing to hear from your mother. And she told me she searched the posted lists of survivors that were put up in London at the end of the war, desperately searching for her parents' names, hoping that they had survived. When she was 62, despite never smoking a cigarette or holding a cigarette, she was diagnosed with lung cancer. And then things became quite serious in our household. We knew that these stories would be lost, that we didn't really know her story, but I didn't know the questions to ask her. And I would fumble along trying to ask her, but she would start crying and I would start crying, and I didn't want to cause my mother pain. So I retreated for fear of actually doing harm to her. And in 1993, she passed away at the age of 65. we had been very shielded from death in our family. We were lucky to escape it. We didn't have many people die. And even when the childhood dog, Skippy, um, when we were told that Skippy was away with a nice family living on a farm, it was years before I figured out Skippy wasn't on a farm. Skippy had come to the end of his life. And so my father came to me during that period where we were sitting Shiva, and he handed me a stack of envelopes. And they were those tissue thin envelopes with beautiful fountain pen writing. And on it, I could see the names of residences: Hackney Hostel, which I understood was the first place my mother lived in London, a hostel, a group home for girls, and then Cockley Clay out in the countryside, which I figured out was the castle. And I could see the dates on the postmark, early August, so that those were the earliest letters written by my grandparents to my mother that she had saved and hidden in a drawer. And I don't know that she hid it, but it just was so personal and so private and so emotional that that's where she kept them. And no understanding that my mother came in the first week of August, I realized that just a couple of weeks later, war would have broken out. That's what brought the KinderTransport to an end. She would probably have been deported and killed with her parents, and I would not be here talking to you today. I decided to go in search of what happened to my mother, what happened to my grandparents, and what was the KinderTransport. That was my way of dealing with my grief. And when I first started making phone calls and looking around, when I would call and tell people I wanted to speak about the KinderTransport, they would say kidney transplant. It was such a little known word back in 1994 when I first started my search. The information was so meager, it took up maybe half a page of typed references on a piece of paper. This was before the internet. The information was just so meager. It wasn't even in the Encyclopedia Judaica. There was no entry. But then one day I was invited to a dinner where my friend's father-in-law was being presented an award at a banquet hall in Beverly Hills. And Margaret Thatcher, who was then the Prime Minister of England, was presenting the award. And at this dinner, they asked all the people who had been on the KinderTransport to stand. And 3 tables of silver and gray-haired people stood. And I was absolutely knocked out. It meant they knew each other. They talked to each other. They sat together in this banquet hall. So I came home re-energized about my research, and I said to my assistant, where I was working at Warner Brothers on all these sitcoms and TV shows, let's look up K in the phone book. Maybe we could find KinderTransport there. And sure enough, there was an entry for a man named Eddie Nussbaum, 15 minutes from my house. He was the head of the Southern California chapter of the KinderTransport Association of America. And I went to Eddie's house. It was, I brought him hamantash, which we never did get around to eat. And he had prepared all these materials. He had all these references and information on the table laid out for me. He was very tough on me. He asked me a lot of questions, which I didn't know the answer to. And I tried to explain that my mother wouldn't talk about any of this stuff, but he was quite generous in giving me materials. So he gave me a book by a woman named Bertha Leverton called I Came Alone. And that was collected stories of the KinderTransport, people's accounts of what had happened to them. He gave me the name of a woman named Amy Gottlieb, a historian in London who had retrieved out of the trash files on the kids, the KinderTransport kids that somebody had thrown out. He also gave me an application to an upcoming 60th anniversary reunion in London in 1998. And I tried to fill it out as best as I could. I decided I needed to be there. It was about 9 months from when he had given it to me. And I thought I had this feeling that I should be there. But the application was geared toward the survivor. What was the name, the maiden name? What was the birth date? What city and country were they from? I wasn't able to answer all the questions, but I had the letters by then, and I could fill out the approximate date of when my mother had traveled, and I could fill out Hackney Hostel and Cockley Clay, the two addresses on the letters. And I sent it off to the P.O. box where you were instructed to send it. And then eventually I got around to calling this man, Kurt Goldberger, which was the final piece of information Eddie had given me. And Kurt Goldberger was the president of the KinderTransport Association of America. And he lived maybe 20 minutes from where my parents were. And I thought, gee, too bad. If only my mother could have spoken to Kurt Goldberger, maybe she would have talked about her experience. So it took me a while to go through all these materials. And eventually one day, on a Sunday, when I could deal with the time difference because I live in Los Angeles and Kurt was on Long Island, I called him. And a woman answered the phone with a very familiar accent to me, sort of British and German and American all combined together. And I said, hello, can I please speak to Kurt Goldberger? And she said, can I ask who's calling? And I said, my name is Debbie Oppenheimer. And she said, I know exactly who you are. I lived with your mother at Hackney Hostel in Cockley Clay. And what had happened was my application that was sent to this P.O. box actually came to Kurt and his wife, Margaret. And she opened a treasure trove of information to me. So I began to learn about my mother, and I eventually did go to Cockley Clay and meet the current baronet and lady who were living there. I met many of the girls, and in the end, I tracked down every one of the girls who had lived at this place with my mother. My mother's story greatly informs Into the Arms of Strangers, but she's not in it. There are a couple of photographs of her and my grandparents in it, but she's not one of the stories that we told. So the way this KinderTransport reunion movement came about is this woman, Bertha Leverton, who is in our movie, in 1988, looked around and saw that her grandson was turning 14. And she realized that was the age she had traveled on the KinderTransport, and that nobody knew what the KinderTransport was, and that she was aging and she wanted people to know about it. And so she decided to organize a reunion. She started very small. She was just a local woman. And 1,000 survivors and their family members showed up for that first reunion, which has spawned many, many more reunions since then. And also led to the establishment of our group, the KinderTransport Association of America. The KinderTransport survivors were very modest. They didn't view themselves as survivors, and they knew that their neighbors and family members and loved ones had suffered a far worse fate of the concentration camps, and in many cases, death. And so they did not think that they had a story that warranted talking about. I will say that the U.S. Holocaust Museum and Yad Vashem and Steven Spielberg Shoah Foundation disagrees with them and does view them as survivors. I had never made a documentary before. As I said, I was working at Warner Brothers. I was the producer of TV shows like George Lopez and Drew Carey and Wanda Sykes and Norm Macdonald. I had worked on shows for HBO and Showtime and PBS, but documentaries are quite different. And so I wanted people to know what the KinderTransport was. In time, I came to believe that this film was beshert, that I was meant to make this film. There were 10,000 children saved, which means that there were 10,000 stories. I think the reason that the many, many people who I reached out and called, who I found through all kinds of different sources, were willing to speak to me because they heard my name Oppenheimer, which is a very German name. I explained to them from the start that my mother was a KinderTransport survivor who was unwilling to talk about it and that she had now passed away. And I think they understood her reasoning. I think they were facing their mortality, searching for their identity. They wanted to honor their parents who had made this momentous decision, and they wanted to give thanks to the British and those who had taken him in. The final thing was, I think they wanted to prove their lives worthy of having been saved. In many cases, the survivors in our film had never told their stories and were telling it for the first time. And because it was a movie and they were on screen, they had to be able to put themselves back there and remember all these incidents and events. I don't think I could have done what they did. The way we picked the people who were in the film was we decided to represent different categories of people. So people who had had good placements, people who had not so good placements, people who remained with their siblings, people who were separated from their siblings, people whose parents had survived, people whose parents had not survived. We had one girl and her mother in the movie. The mother had lived to put the daughter on the train and be reunited with her in England. And then we also had a woman who made the decision to take in a child, which we thought was an interesting kind of person who would take in a strange child. And then finally, we had two living rescuers, people who had helped to get the children out of Nazi-occupied territories. So we had Nicholas Winton, who has gone on to tremendous fame and recognition for what he did, and a man who's not as well known, but equally heroic and important, named Norbert Wollheim. And when we found out about Norbert, who was a social worker in Germany, who helped process thousands of children through all this very demanding paperwork required by the Germans and the British, he had hoped that he and his wife and child would be saved. But unfortunately, he suffered the terrible irony of saving all these children. And at the selection point, when he, his wife and child were deported to Auschwitz, his wife and child went in one direction and he went in another, and he never saw them again. We kept being told when we heard about Norbert, hurry up, you need to get him quickly, he's not well. And so we were able to raise the money to do an interview with him. We did an interview. He's wonderful in the film, very powerful, very expressive and eloquent. And 5 weeks later, he passed away, and we collapsed. We didn't know what to do. We lost our funding on the same day we learned he had died. And I was working full time. I had never raised money for something like this before. I didn't know where to begin. But thankfully, Warner Brothers recognized that more stories would be lost. An amazing man named Barry Meyer, who at the time was the head of television, and he stepped in to use the success of movies like Batman and TV shows like ER and Friends to enable this story to be told and to be preserved. Judi Dench was the narrator of the movie. She was meant to be the universal voice of the mother. And we could not make this film today. Only two of the survivors who are in the film are still alive. We wanted to pose the question, would you send your child away? And would you take in a child, which are kind of unanswerable. When we asked the survivors that question, not one of them would be willing to put themselves in their parents' shoes to make such a pronouncement that they would do that. We asked them all what they took and what they had saved. So like my mother, having this unusual pen and pencil set of all the things that she might have saved, we found amazing treasures as precious as gold to each of the people who had these artifacts, including a tube of toothpaste tube, which was completely squeezed dry. But the girl saved it her entire life because her mother had packed it for her. There's I call them all girls. Of course, they were women by the time we filmed them. But one of the girls says something that I think is quite apt, which was that it was only 6 years of a very long life, but those 6 years stick with you for the rest of your life. Sarah Bloomfield, who is the head of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, who was an official partner on this film and where we had our premiere, said that the KinderTransport was a tiny glimmer of hope during an enormous catastrophe. That it happened was cause for hope. That it was so tiny was cause for concern. There were 1.5 million children killed in the concentration camps. 10,000 of those children were saved by the KinderTransport. And of those 10,000, 2 went on to win the Nobel Prize. So if you do the calculation, what was lost is incalculable. Much has come about as a result of this movie, which we could talk about later on. The word KinderTransport has entered the lexicon. I don't expect that people will have seen this movie or really know what the KinderTransport is, but a lot of people are familiar with the word, and now they don't say kidney transplant to me anymore. We have study guides that were written in Britain and America and Germany. Our study guide is downloadable for free via the internet. And in 2001, we had a fantastic event for a movie like this, which brought honor to all the survivors and which gained the movie greater awareness and greater visibility. So before we start doing questions and answers, Ashley, maybe you can show that clip of this nice event that happened for the film.
Sure. Okay, so.
The one with Samuel Jackson.
Yep. Ashley, the Oscar?
Yep. Hold
Yep.
on 1 second.
And the Oscar goes to Into the Arms of Strangers, Stories of the KinderTransport, Mark Jonathan Harris and Deborah Oppenheimer.
This is the first Academy Award and nomination for Deborah Oppenheimer. This is the second Academy Award for Mark Jonathan Harris. He won an Oscar for Best Documentary Short Subject in 1967 for The Redwoods.
This is in honor of the KinderTransport survivors who have inspired us with their honesty and their eloquence and their humanity, and for their parents who love them so much they had the courage to send them away. The film is in memory of my mother, who was one of the 10,000 children, and my grandparents, whom she never saw again. We'd like to thank everybody at Warner Brothers for their extraordinary leap of faith, particularly Barry Meyer, Jerry Levin, and Bruce Rosenblum, as well as Dan Feldman. And I'd like to thank my family, my friends, my colleagues, and my partner, Bruce Helford.
And I'd like to thank our wonderful team, particularly Kate Amon, Don Lenzer, Lee Holdridge, Gary Rydstrom, Dame Judi Dench, and my lovely wife. It's been a great privilege as a documentarian to share the pain and triumph of the people in our film. They've enriched all our lives. Thank you.
And now maybe if we could take if you have any questions, maybe we could do some questions.
That was amazing, really, the whole thing. We'd like to open it up for questions. So if there's anybody that has any questions, I know anybody would like to raise their hand or chat in anything. Jen, go ahead.
So was there did any of the children get reunited with their families? Like, did they have documentation? Was there a few, a lot of them, any, or relatives in general?
We don't have exact numbers, but originally it was thought that there was a very small percentage who got to see their parents again, but it was more than that. I wouldn't say half the children saw their parents again. It definitely was not that many, but 30-40% of the children saw their parents again. And definitely some of the children found other relatives, whether it was a sibling. For those who, during the war, a lot of the time children were separated, and because of petrol and distance and just war in general, they couldn't see their siblings, even if their siblings had gotten out. In some cases, parents were able to get out on domestic visas. So these may have been very accomplished people, and their only way to get into England was to get out as butlers or maids or chauffeurs. Some people were able to get to Palestine, South America. Unfortunately, the United States had a measure in Congress, the Wagner-Rogers Act, that was an attempt to bring in 20,000 children, and that died in committee. So the United States did not do what the British did. But yes, people did get to see family members again in some cases. But one of the things we learned from the movie was that that's a lot of years at a very formative age to be separated from your family. And there was a young man in our movie who you see was 7 years old when he went on the KinderTransport. And we see his foster mother in the film. And she was a wonderful woman. She never tried to usurp being his parents, but she put a roof over his head, got him to school, took care of him. She had a son who was like a brother to him. And then the parents needed to get their lives together after the war ended. So he didn't see them again until he was 16 years old. So 9 years passed from a 7-year-old boy's life, and the bonds were broken. It was very complicated for him. He had attached to this foster family, which he needed to do in order to survive. And I heard that from other people too. So I always thought, if only my mother had seen her parents again, everything would be okay. But it wasn't as simple as that. And we heard many stories from survivors of the challenges of being reunited with their parents.
Yeah, and I see Rose, you have your hand up. If you want to unmute. Hold on one sec. Oh, go ahead.
I saw several years ago a movie that was similar about the British children being shipped out of the city because it was constantly being bombed to the outlands of the area of England and Ireland and all over. Were any of those children friends, or did they meet a lot of the KinderTransport children?
I think they were. So what you're talking about is, I think it's actually called Operation Pied Piper. And the British knew that war was imminent. And it's one of the reasons Judi Dench agreed to narrate our movie for a multitude of reasons. But one of them is because her husband was one of the boys that you're talking about. He was evacuated out of London to Wales. When my mother left Hackney Hostel in London to go to the castle, she was being evacuated with this entire group home to get them out of harm's way from the anticipated bombing. So they were part of Pied Piper, but they kept those girls together. There were other children in her cohort, in her group, but they didn't really mingle. I don't think they really knew each other. And I don't think that was so much the case for a good many of the children.
But it was during the same time. And I want to thank you for making the movie. It's something that everybody should see.
Yeah, agree.
Thank you very much.
And Deborah, there's another question here. So why were the Nazis actually willing to let the children go, and why were the British willing to take in the children?
So the Nazis, this was before the final solution. And so the Nazis viewed the mostly Jewish kids, or there was a term that a lot of them didn't like called Mischling, if they were mixed marriage. They viewed them as spawners, spawners of more Jewish blooded children. And so they just wanted them out, as long as they didn't take money or valuables. So that was forbidden. They couldn't take money or valuables, but they were happy to get them out of the country. but they made it really challenging to get out. The paperwork was impossible. You had to have multiple copies and everything impeccable and perfect. You had to find you had to find your way to be accepted onto the KinderTransport. As for the British people, they created a dividing line. They were frightened of people being a threat to jobs and to the economy, so they drew the line at children. And that's primarily who they were willing to take in. It was a wonderful thing to have done, but the parents were in this impossible position of having to send their children away. And could any of us do that? So when we show the movie, when it first came out, a lot of the time it was male viewers who really got emotional watching this movie because the idea of sending their children away was so painful to them, they couldn't fathom it.
Well, that brings me to the thought of that one father that put his daughter in the movie, put her on the KinderTransport and literally held her hand and pulled her out of the KinderTransport, and she fell on the floor.
Right. So what happened is a lot of the time, parents were not allowed on the platform. Many of the KinderTransports left at night in the dark, and the parents had to say goodbye in whatever reception room there was, and then the kids went alone onto the platform. A lot, many, not all. But this one girl in our movie, Lori, we were told about. And what happened was she was in the window seat. Her father was able to get on the platform. Her father was actually quite handicapped and walked with canes and had difficulty. But when her window was down, and when that train began to move, you know that a train doesn't pick up speed immediately, he reached into the window and pulled her out of the train. And as a result, eventually, he was deported, she was deported, the mother was deported. She went through multiple concentration camps, I think about 8 of them. When the war ended and she was liberated, she weighed, I think, 58 pounds. Her mother was killed in the Holocaust, but her father survived, and they never talked about it. But so we were told about her, and we just thought that story is almost too unbelievable. But it was a great counterpoint. You have children who were killed, children who were saved by the KinderTransport. Here's the what if. What if you didn't get on that train? Then what happened? And she was the embodiment of it. So we were thrilled to find her. And I, in particular, really loved her. She was a wonderful woman.
Yeah, no, I mean, and the story with the redhead where the sisters came together, where she brought the sister over. And a lot of these kids from the movie, they were like, the parents told them, you have to get us out, and they were 7, 8 years old, and they were given this responsibility. Your brother, your uncle, your aunt, your sister. There's that one story where they literally gave a list to, I don't know how old that particular person was, but in the movie, it was just amazing. And they went to go get all the people to out.
Yeah, that was a very difficult thing that happened for some of the children, where their parents said to them, be good to the person who took you in, behave, and maybe they will help us. And it was a tremendous responsibility for the kids. Yeah, that was quite hard. And we do have a girl in the movie who that happened with. And in her case, she was able to help her parents get out. That definitely did not always happen.
Yeah. And I see Pat Potter. Go ahead if you want to unmute.
Deborah, were most of the families in England good families that the children could settle in with?
They were not all good families, unfortunately. So there were good placements, but there were also placements that were not great, where people were taken advantage of and put to work. And these might have been girls that did not come from a home that expected that. There weren't enough Jewish families that came forward. So there was this one group called the Christadelphians who got together to take children in, and Nicholas Winton, who has received so much recognition for saving children, ran out of people to put them with. So he put some children with Christadelphians who were not forthcoming in all cases with the child regarding their heritage. And he got severely criticized for that and was really put on the defensive. And he said, well, I would say they were all alive at the end of the war. But you will, if you see our movie, which I hope you will, you'll see that this one boy who was taken in at the age of 7 until 16 had a wonderful placement and stayed in touch with that family his whole life. Other people, not as much, including my mother. My mother bounced around from place to place to place, and she was with one newlywed family. And it's kind of hard to believe that these young newlyweds took her in after an appeal in their congregation, but they also put her to work. And even the daughter of that family, who was born while my mother was there and who my mother stayed in touch with her entire life, I'm still in touch with her, says that her mother was not so nice. So that was a little bit.
And when your mother went to the hostel with a bunch of other girls, was that a reasonably good situation?
That was a complicated situation. So then you were with children, like-minded people who were going through the same thing, but they talked about crying into their pillows at night. They said that crying was contagious. And that my mother's story was very complicated because the matron was a very accomplished young teacher from Berlin, who was the daughter of an ultra-Orthodox rabbi who founded the Aguda movement. But not all these girls were Orthodox. So it was her household, and she ran the household as a very observant Orthodox household. But my mother never spoke about that, so I don't know how my mother felt about that. I think she was from a pretty observant household. But for some of the girls, she wouldn't allow them to open their letters on the Sabbath, and they could see the letters in full view, and they knew their parents had written. And so they had very complicated feelings toward this woman who believed that she knew their circumstances best of all and was best positioned to care for them. So very complicated dynamics, very.
And there was one thing in the movie also, Deborah, where the children, a lot of them didn't speak English. And a lot of people there was that one scene in the movie where they're all on the eating in the very cold with snow on their plate. They said they had food and snow because it was so chilly, right? That was like a part in the movie. It was so like riveting because they were sitting there and I forget what they called it, but the people would just like they would come in and just select who they wanted to take with them. And one person agreed and said they spoke English and just agreed. She didn't even know what the word Orthodox meant. They said, they asked her a question and she said, yes. And then she wrote, what is that? Like she was 7 years old. She had no idea.
Yeah, so some of the girls did speak a little English before they came, or more than a little. Some of them had never traveled. They'd never gone anywhere. And the German girls talk about the Austrians challenging their form of speaking German. And then you had Czech kids who spoke Czech. You had Polish kids. So it was a whole mishmash. But you also heard stories from the kids who talked about wanting to learn English so quickly. And we have one boy in our movie who says he never spoke German again. He was so desperate to fit in and assimilate and belong after years of being tormented and ostracized by Hitler Youth and in his classroom and in the community, that he never spoke German again. Although his daughter told us that at the end of his life, really at the very end of his life, he spoke German again. So that was really curious.
Yeah. And that was an intriguing story. He said he was very scared of the teacher. He didn't like the English teacher. So he said, I'm going to learn this really, really quick. And he learned it like so quickly. So he never had to go back to see the teacher again. And
exactly.
That was really interesting. There is a couple more, there's some questions here. Did the parents have to pay to get the papers approved?
In some cases, Nicholas Winton had to raise £50 per child, which would be the equivalent of about $1,500 now. But mostly these social services kind of groups, the B'nai B'rith, places like that, help to put up the money. So the children were not, so they prioritized children who were in orphanages because they had lost a parent. There was this narrow corridor of boys who were 16 and 17 who had been arrested on Kristallnacht. And the telltale sign of that was in many cases they shaved their heads. And when they released them from the camps, they said, you have to leave, you have to get out. So those 16 and 17-year-old boys were prioritized as well. And then my mother didn't fit either of those categories. She was able to come. The irony of the 16, 17-year-old boys who came over to Britain was that when there was the fear of a fifth column uprising, they interned some of these KinderTransport boys in internment camps behind bars. So they weren't concentration camps, but they feared what they were. They didn't know what they were, and all they knew of camps were from Kristallnacht and what had happened to the local men.
And the letters, okay, so there's this part in the movie where all the letters, you see the words, you hear the speaking of these letters, and they were really so touching when you're listening to them right back and forth. And so Jen had a question, were the letters found with any of the children having the parents explaining why they did it? And I do remember that one girl that she blamed the parents, like, you don't want me anymore. And she apologized to them in the letter that they ended up saving her life. Like, she didn't realize it at the time. She thought she was they were getting rid of her. She took it very personal, and then she wrote them saying that she apologized to them. But were letters actually found with the kids, or anybody still have these?
Yeah, no. So what happened was back at that time, children were seen and not heard. And the parents tried to put a good face on what was going on. They needed to get the kids on the train. And so Bertha Leverton says they would tell them, we'll see you again. They said to be obedient, be appreciative, be grateful. And so they tried to be, in most cases, the parents tried to be positive and to not frighten the children. And then in those early months, I mean, the first KinderTransport left on December 1st, 1938. So there was a good amount of time where the parents could be corresponding. After September 1st, 1939, correspondence became much more difficult. And my mother did tell me a little bit more. And one of the things she said was that the matron was fearful that the children could be endangered, being found with these letters on them, and the parents could be endangered. And she naively encouraged the girls to destroy the letters. They were so precious and sentimental that in my mother's case, she did destroy some of the letters, but she hid some in her shoe and in her gas mask box. And that's how my mother's letters survived. But I have another project that I'm doing on the KinderTransport where I was able to read 1,000 letters that were letters that one girl wrote to her sister, that her sister saved, that another girl wrote to her parents, and the parents were deported. And when they were deported, when they were deported, they gave all the letters to their daughter for safekeeping. And then in other instances, the girls and boys saved the letters. So there are quite a few letters that survived, but whether they're that informative, you see glimpses of it. You read through the lines in these letters, and there'll be a sentence about going somewhere or doing something, and you understand, or that they no longer live somewhere, or he's found work, but he's tired of standing on his legs. I mean, some of these references meant that somebody was undergoing forced labor, or parents were making desperate efforts to go places and right places to find an escape route.
Interesting. And there's actually two questions regarding the United States. Did any other country volunteer to take in these children, particularly the United States? And were Americans aware of the KinderTransport during this time?
You know, that's a good question. I don't know what the Americans knew about the KinderTransport, but we know that the American effort died in committee and never happened. And Eleanor Roosevelt supported it, but it did not happen. There are many reasons. We weren't that many years out of the Depression, but there was definitely anti-Semitism. There was definitely a fear of jobs being taken and a burden on the economy. There was even a line that it was contrary to the laws of God and nature to take in kids. The Dominican Republic is pretty well known for having taken in kids. When I refer, not kids, people, Jews, when I refer to the KinderTransport, I'm speaking about the effort that saved the nearly 10,000 children from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Danzig, which was the Free State. But there are other smaller KinderTransport efforts, one that came to the United States where people took in children, but not a government effort. Those were individual efforts, and other people got to Holland or Switzerland. That was not the focus of my research and my work, so I know less about that, although there's a project called 1,000 Children about the 1,000 children taken into the United States. And then there's some highly celebrated and regarded individuals who took in 50 children or took in a handful of children, and those people did something wonderful as well.
Amazing. And I see is there anyone else that has a hand up? There's a couple things in the chat, but anybody have any other questions? Yeah, Maxim, go ahead.
Yeah, after 1942, that didn't happen. There was no more transport, was
No, there was no more transport after 1939, September 1939, it ended. So by 1942, the deportations to the concentration camps were in full swing.
Yeah.
And what was the youngest age? I know they did it up until 17. If you were past
Infant. I mean,
it was infant.
Misunderstanding about the KinderTransport. There were stories of infants in baskets being put on the KinderTransport, not in large numbers, but desperate parents didn't do that. And so that a child has no recollection of their parents, no recollection of their history.
And why was it ever mentioned or like no one really does talk, even in school growing up, you hear about the Holocaust, the Nazis, all these things, but the KinderTransport is very, very not really mentioned. Some people don't even know what the word, never even have heard of it. And is there a reason why it was kept so never, broadcasted past, like in schools or knowledge or anything?
I think the KinderTransport children didn't talk about it. And the focus was on the concentration camps and on the destruction. We do have a happy clip. I can see that people are asking about a clip. I don't have a clip of the movie that we set aside for tonight, but we have another very joyous, very special clip that happened when 14 of the 16 people in the movie went back to England for the British premiere. And Ashley, maybe you could show that.
Sure. Okay. We'll roll that.
It's very gratifying. They're great fun, and 14 of them are here tonight.
I've come all the way from New Zealand to see my wrinkled face on the screen.
Great Britain was the only country willing to open its doors. There was no other nation willing to take in the children. By being here tonight, he honors the 10,000 children and their parents and the people who did so much to save them.
Well, I came from New Jersey, America. I didn't realize that I was going to get 15 minutes worth of fame.
It's wonderful to meet so many of them over the years, and it is really, I'm very, very happy to be here tonight.
You see the resilience of children and the humanity of these survivors and the humanity of the British who were able to take them in is also very inspiring.
For me, it's a lovely occasion because I've come to see my sister who's come all the way from New Zealand.
We just searched the world. We have a woman here from Israel. We have people from the United States, people from various parts of Britain. One of our rescuers is 92 years old. One of our surviving mothers who's in the film is 95 years old. So the people who we were able to find are quite extraordinary and very rare.
You know, this is a once-in-a-lifetime thing. It's certainly something I wouldn't want to miss. And also, I like to see my foster brother as often as possible. He lives in London, and I live in New York. It's a ways.
I always liked London. It's a little mystical.
To see about a dozen of us there is just great. We know we have this in common, and there's this bond between us.
I think it's a most wonderful film. I am really honored to be here.
It's quite important that people know what happened and how good England was to take us in.
It was a sort of horrible time and magical time because without the kindness of others, we certainly wouldn't be here.
Amazing.
It's a little bittersweet for me to see that because all but two of them are gone now. But that was an extraordinary evening.
Wow. That was amazing. And how was it? What did it feel like to win the Academy Award for this film?
That was an out-of-body experience. It's very important for a film like this to have that kind of honor. So what it means is that the film got recognized by the Library of Congress as being the definitive film on the KinderTransport. And in 2014 that happened, and now it will be preserved for all time. And HBO has it, keeps it on the air, and you can find it in other ways. And I don't mean to pat myself on the back, but I think the film is timeless, and I think it stands up. And I'm looking at, people on this screen, and some of you are the age of the people who were in the film at the time that they were reflecting back on their lives. And I assume some of you on this screen have children or nieces and nephews or neighbors or favorite young people in their lives. And to think about somebody going through this, children separated from parents, we know that still happens, and we know that there's a price to pay for that.
Absolutely. I mean, there's comments, everyone's crying. Should have gave out Kleenexes. I mean, it is so touching. I mean, and just hearing that this actually went on and really hearing it from your perspective, because it happened to your mother, and that is really the thing. And the fact that you were so inspired to reach further and find out, and that you lived in the world of hush on it. You didn't talk about it in your family, and you wanted to dig deeper. And thank you so much to bring this to all of us, because it's really amazing. Your story, this movie, I mean, it is. Ashley put it on the screen. You could, I got it on Amazon Prime. It's Amazon Prime. I believe it's HBO. Ashley, what's that?
Apple TV.
Apple TV. Highly recommend. I mean, it is really an amazing, amazing film. And you'll see, and the people, you get so brought into their life, and you feel it, and you really do feel as they're speaking that trauma never goes away. It is with them at that point when they're telling the stories. And what were they at these points when they were telling the stories in their 70s and 80s? Some of them, it's still there. It never left them. Some of them don't even, really talk about, they just don't like to hear certain words. They don't, and they remember a lot of things.
There's one question you asked me that I didn't fully answer, which is that why did the British take them in? And although they limited it, I do think it's in the British character to give and to be of service and to do things. I do want to mention that I can't seem to get away from children with disrupted childhoods. And so there is another documentary I did, very different, but still about children with difficult childhoods. And that's a movie called Foster, about the foster care system. That's also currently on HBO and I think Apple and Hulu and all those other places where you could find the movie. And that was inspired at the same time that I lost my mother and started the research on this movie. I started doing volunteer work in a local public school, and I met this little boy named Patrick and discovered that he was living in an orphanage in Hollywood, actually the same orphanage where Marilyn Monroe lived, and that we could lose that now, Ashley. And that I enjoyed working on a documentary so much that we reunited the team from Into the Arms of Strangers, and we made this movie. And there are also some really, I'm just knocked out by these people who you can stick a camera on them and get them to tell such personal, emotional things. And they do it, and they find it cathartic. It does help them. In one case, one of the girls in Into the Arms of Strangers says that her nightmares came to an end. But I hope you'll get to see both of those films because the people are sweet and the stories are painful, but beautiful. And you get to meet a lot of inspiring people in the course of it.
Absolutely. And Pat, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, I was interested to see Prince Charles attending the evening that you were all together. And I know that Queen Elizabeth II understands World War II very, very, very well. And it seems as if perhaps she's passed it on to her family members as well.
It's a huge deal to have a royal premiere, absolutely huge. And I always wanted it for obvious reasons. And I asked Warner Brothers if there was any possibility, and they were able to achieve it. And then Prince Charles met with everybody, and we were told that of all the royals at the time who we might have done this with, Charles does his homework. And so he had read up on, we provided little thumbnail sketches of everybody, and he took that in, and he was so respectful to them and so kind to them. And you're right about Queen Elizabeth. She was a peer. She was the same age as these kids. And when they came over to London, they were in the Girl Guides, and she was a Girl Guide, and she served in the military. And they were given the opportunity to serve in the military as they grew older toward the end of the war. So she is an enormous, enormous figure. And that really was the icing on the cake for Warner Brothers. Was absolutely fantastic to the people in the movie. And they flew everybody to London with a guest, and put them up at a great hotel and brought them in cars to the premiere and then to a dinner reception afterwards. And I think that everybody was very excited at the honor of the Academy Awards, but they were really excited to come to this screening to meet Prince Charles. And I have a very special place in my heart for him because he was very kind to them, really kind.
He seemed absolutely engaged that evening.
Yeah. I mean, it was actually kind of funny because you're given a whole list of protocol. Don't do this, do this. You Bob, you don't speak until he speaks. There's a whole set of rules, and you don't touch him. But try to tell a little Jewish woman, to stop her ways. And Diana had already been killed. He was already with Camilla, and he's going around the circle, and one of the women reached to his arm and said, "I'm so sorry about Diana." And you're saying, "Don't touch the prince, don't touch you're not supposed to touch him." And he was completely unfazed by it and good-natured about it all.
So he seemed totally engaged, which was really nice.
He told me he didn't know anything about it. And then I said something incredibly stupid to him. They seated me next to him during the movie. And I leaned over and I said, your mother's in this.
I'm a retired history teacher, and I'm sorry that more of this was not included in history courses that I taught, although I think I mentioned it to my students. But, the teaching of history is getting a little bit better as time goes on, and I hope it continues to get even better, that this sort of absence of education will disappear at some point.
Well, the educational department of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum is very aware of the movie, and I bug them from time to time to say, get it into the curriculum, but we don't have a national curriculum where you could do that, although money has now been allocated for Holocaust education. And I do get to speak to schools. I receive invitations to do that, and I always do that whenever I'm asked, because I love that. I love the idea of new kids learning about this story.
And I live in Canada, and so we have 10 provincial education courses. And when things like computer science and other things came in, sometimes history got dropped a little bit, but then there are often resurgences where we realize that the students need to know certain things, and hopefully it will come back into the curriculum.
Well, I can tell you one thing about Canada, which is of these 2 Nobel Prize winners who I mentioned, one of them was sent to Canada to be in an internment camp. He was deported from England and sent to an internment camp. And the Canadian internment camp that he was in was so fertile and so lively with intellectual activity and fervor that, unlike a lot of the KinderTransport children, he got a great education and went on to college and academia and won a Nobel Prize. And he did attribute that in part to his experience in Canada.
Good to hear. Lovely to hear.